In this clip, we'll learn how to create UVs for a few pieces of our asset so that 2D textures can be used with them. Okay, great. So if you've finished modeling an asset like the one I'm looking at here, part of the process of creating an asset from start to finish would be commonly referred to as shading. Now, this process known as shading means that what we're going to be doing is creating materials that define a unique look for many of the surfaces of our model. Now, these materials, sometimes they can do this by themselves, but sometimes these materials need the assistance of 2D textures to create the look we're going for. Now, 2D textures can be mapped to 3D objects like the ones we have here, but in order for this to happen successfully, we need to create a UV layout for each one of these objects. A UV layout, you can think of this as simply a two-dimensional map that maps a two-dimensional texture to a three-dimensional object. Now, in order to create a UV layout, oftentimes we have to take a more complex shape like this one and begin to cut it apart. Otherwise, it can't be unfolded in ways that we need it to be unfolded. So, the beautiful thing about UVs and this process of creating UVs here inside of Maya is that no two artists is going to approach this in exactly the same way. I'm going to show you a very basic way to start the UV creation process, and we're going to, in the modeling tool set, we're going to come up here to the UV menu, and let's go to the UV editor. Now, this UV editor is a floating window. As you can see, there is a UV editing workspace that you can get to right up here if you prefer to use that. I personally prefer the window, but let's talk about the naming UV and where that comes from. So you can see here kind of the main portion of this UV editor is this grid on the left-hand side. Now, this grid is divided by these two blue lines, two axes. The one moving from left to right across the grid, this is going to be the U axis. And the one moving up and down is going to be the V. That's where the name comes from. So in looking at this 2D space, when we're laying out UVs, it's commonly done right up here in the top right quadrant of the grid. This area right here is commonly referred to as the 0 to 1 space, reading the numbers on our grid from 0 to 1 and from 0 to 1. That's where that comes from. So, in the case of my asset here, a lot of my pieces of geometry are already going to have some kind of UVs if I select them. You can see the body of our ship has some, the wing has some, the cockpit looks like it has a little bit of a UV done. So a lot of times UVs are kind of a byproduct of modeling, especially if you're starting with a primitive object. But usable UVs is another story. Really, the main goal in laying out a 3D object in 2D space like this is to do it in such a way that any kind of texture that you put on top of it won't be distorted. Now, let me show you some ways we can sort of gauge distortion. The first way would be with this heat map right here. The goal to have distortion-free UVs would be to have a completely white color to the UVs when using this. As you can see, we have lots of red and blue here, so that's a lot of distortion right now. Another way we can sort of gauge this is by turning on a checker texture, as you can see here. I'm going to go ahead and click the checker button. You can see a checker texture appears inside my UV texture editor, and if we come down here and zoom in on this wing, you can see here that all of our texture is really distorted. None of these are squares. They're more like rectangles. Well, that's not a good thing. That tells me there's a lot of distortion here. And in fact, some of it is so bad that the texture is getting pretty mangled right over here. So what we need to do is we need to create usable UVs. And for a simple piece of geometry like this wing that really doesn't have any thickness, it's single-sided, a really good way for a piece like this would be to use a simple projection as a starting point. Now we can create a UV projection right here from the UV editor. If we look under the Create rollout, you can also create them up here under the UV menu. Now there's several different ones. We're going to cover the planar projection in this video, but let's go ahead and shift click on the planar option here. That'll get us to the planar mapping options box. Now just to start off here, I'm going to come up to my edit menu and choose reset settings, just so we're starting from the same place. So the way this works, if we leave this set to bounding box, is that we need to choose an axis to project from. You can see the default is currently X. For this particular projection, we probably wouldn't want to project in the X because that'll come in from the side of our wing. The best axis for this piece of geometry to project in would be the Y axis. So let's go ahead and select Y, and let's just click Apply. Now when we do that, let me just move this to the side and show you what happened in the UV editor. You can see here that, well, we definitely have some UVs being projected here. You can see we have sort of this triangular shape, and we have this little square inside of our viewport, this little manipulator. This is called a projection manipulator, and I want to show you what happens as we start to move this around. So if we were to grab these blue controls in the corners and scale, you can see that our projection manipulator scales uniformly. The larger the manipulator gets, the smaller the UV shell gets here inside the 0 to 1. Now, ultimately, we really want to be able to take up as much of this space as possible with this shell so that we can really maximize that space. If we had a texture that was, say, 1K by 1K or 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels, and we had a shell that was this size taking up the space it is now, we would effectively be wasting all of these pixels in this area right here. So in this case, we would probably want to leave that set to the size that the planar projection set it to, maybe right there. Now, these handles on the sides are going to scale that projection manipulator non-uniformly. So we can come in and begin to scale like so. And lastly here, if we click on this little red T right here, it will change this manipulator in the middle to a little ring, and we can click that ring and begin to rotate the manipulator, as you can see here. And you can see the effect inside the UV editor. Now, based on this projection, you can see here, we've kind of got a manipulator in this spot right here. Let's go ahead and actually come over and shift click the planar projection options again, and I'll just jump in and reset these. Now, in a case like this, what we could use is this best plane option. And what that'll allow Maya to do is it'll allow Maya to determine what the best angle to project from is based on the geometry we have selected. So let's go ahead and apply that. We'll go ahead and click that button here. And you can see here, well, now we have kind of a different triangular shape. But if we look over here, you can see where our projection manipulator has fallen. Now, one thing about this is with these settings here, this UV projection is always going to try and take up the most space it can here inside of the 0 to 1 space. Now, if we were to come in and just turn on our checker texture again and come in and look at that, what we may see is that there may be a little bit of distortion, a little bit of stretching in these squares. Now, if that is the case and you want to go for perfect squares, what we could do is come in here inside of our planar projection options, and we could turn this keep image width height ratio on. Now, watch what happens if I click that box and go ahead and project this. You can see here that the projection now is not trying to take up that entire space, but the resulting texture here should be a little more uniform, as you can see. All right, great. Now, as I mentioned before, there really are more than one way we can begin to approach laying out UVs, even for an object as simple as these wings. Really, no two artists is going to do this the same way. Now, if you're interested in learning more about UVs, we do have several courses over on Pluralsight that can help you out with this.